Revelation 1. Today I'm going to finish the chapter, reading verses 9 through 20, starting with verses 9 through 11. I, John, your brother, and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos, because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Here in these verses, John gives us some background information about where he's writing, where he is when he's writing the final book of the Bible. And he also prefaces what chapters 2 and 3 will be about in verse 11. Talking about how the Lord told him to send what he saw to the 7 churches listed. Verses 12 and 13 say, I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. Here is where John begins speaking on the visions that he received, starting with the vision of 7 lampstands and Jesus Christ, mentioned as like a son of man. The 7 lampstands here, we can assume, with what we just read in verse 11, that these are the 7 churches that John just mentioned. And actually, as we read to the end of this chapter, we will see that Jesus says this to be true after he talks to John within the vision. Continuing with verses 14 through 16, his head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze, glowing in a furnace, his voice like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. The end of verse 13, as well as verses 14 through 16, all describe how Jesus looks within this vision, and talk about what he contains, including holding 7 stars in his right hand, and a double-edged sword protruding from his mouth. One key detail that I want to talk about here is the final line of verse 16, which says, his face was like the sun, shining in all of its brilliance. This is one thing that will also get talked about later on in Revelation, but it leads to a point that when we live in eternity with God in the new heavens and the new earth, there will be no sun that we see today. The sun will not be in the sky, because God and his glory will be the source of light across the entire earth and all domains. And that will be the only light that we need to live. Just like how we can't stare into the sun because of how bright it is on this earth, no one can even glance at God and his glory because of how bright and magnificent he is. This paints well with the Old Testament story of people touching the Ark of the Covenant when they were trying to move it into David's temple from the tent it was staying in. The people tried to catch the Ark of the Covenant from falling, and they died on contact. Because no one can touch or have any contact with the glory and magnificence of God. So we can't look at him either. When Moses had the burning bush, Moses was still staring at the ground, because if he had looked into the bush, he would have died on the spot. Because the glory of God is too strong for our human body and human mind and brain to comprehend it all. Continuing with verses 17 through 18, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Another example of when another person couldn't glance at the glory of God. John here fell at his feet so he wouldn't die, because he knows that he can't glance at God. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive, forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. Here in verse 17, we get Jesus saying something that confirms what was talked about at the end of verse 8, of him saying that he is the first and the last. Similar to the Alpha and the Omega from verse 8, it has the same meaning, just a more specific tone in this occurrence. Jesus also says that he holds the keys to death and Hades. Now, Hades isn't actually the place that non-believers will go for eternity. Sadly, that is a place much, much worse than what Hades is in biblical terms. Hades is also referred to as the abyss later on in Revelation 20, and it is the place where the devil and the beasts will be thrown for the millennium, or the 1,000-year reign of Jesus on this current earth. This is before the creation of new heavens and the new earth. At the end of the second battle, after the millennium, then all non-believers will be thrown with Satan and the demons and the beasts into the lake of fire for all eternity. Hades and the lake of fire are different places within biblical texts and context, and the lake of fire is a much worse place to be. Now, rounding out chapter 1, verse 20 ends it all. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and of the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Now, here we get the meaning of the 7 stars and the 7 lampstands, and there isn't much to expound on here. Besides that's exactly what John had earlier mentioned. The 7 churches that he's about to write letters to in chapters 2 and 3. Those are the churches that the 7 lampstands represent. That is exactly what is painted in this picture of the vision. Remember, those churches being Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Each one of those churches represents a different lampstand, and each one of the stars represents a different angel sent to those churches. In this context, the word angel is being used as a messenger, just like Gabriel was at Jesus' birth. These angels will bring messages to these 7 cities that are talked about in chapters 2 and 3, and the 7 churches within them. Overall, the first chapter of Revelation gives us a good vision of John's background, where he was when he was writing it, and introduces some introductory topics that will continue to show up throughout the rest of the book. One thing to notice here is that there are 7 lampstands and 7 stars. 7 here will be a recurring number within the book of Revelation. And sadly, most of the time when it's mentioned, the number and the things associated with it will not be pretty.